So let's review some useful array operations. First, most important thing, or the number one operation we want to review is how to compare arrays. Remember, arrays are objects, so the equal operator is not comparing directly object to object. Just like in string comparison, the equal operator will only compare the address stored in the variable. So here, first array pointing to a array object, second array pointing to another array object. If they are pointing to the same object, then this first array equals to second array will return true. But if they are pointing to two different objects, then this equal to will return false because they are pointing to different address, even though the elements in the array, in the two array objects are identical. So you are going to get a false, even though the two objects are identical, but they are different objects. This is the same as a string. So in order to compare array, you need to write a new method. But in array, we don't have a equals method, just like in string, just like what a string has. The reason is array may contain object. And how do you compare two objects is up to you, to whoever doing the comparison. So because of this, there's no such thing as a generic array dot equals method. You need to write your own comparison. Now for integer array, this is an example. We will compare first if they are of the same length. If they are of a different length, of course, it will be false, right? Then the next, we are going to go through each array's element and compare array element by element until there's a not equals. Then we will have a flag saying it's a false. Now, note here, generally, when you do array operation, you will use a for loop. You will use a for loop. But here, the textbook example uses a while. And the reason they use while is because there is a flag. They want to make sure as soon as the first not equal is discovered, as soon as there is a sign that the array is not equal, you don't need to do comparison anymore and you will exit. If you do not use this array equals here in the while loop, in the loop condition, you will need to write a break to break out. And that's what we are trying to avoid. But on the other hand, while this is a totally legit loop control, you can also write a for loop for it. And I'm going to leave this to you as something to work on your own to write this while, convert this into a for loop. And finally, because this sample code is just like it says, it's just a sample, so it print out the result. But if you're writing a method, you will need to return this arrays equal. So useful array operations. There are a whole bunch of useful array operations, but in general, just like the array comparison, when you are doing array operation, there are two parts. The first part is initialization of certain flag or recording variable. The second one is going through array elements one by one. Now, while you are going through array operations array elements one by one, you are going through this usually comparing to something that is outside of array. You cannot do an array. For example, if you are doing a comparison, you need to have outside the record indicating whether it's true or false. You cannot record this inside the array. Similarly, when you are calculating the highest or lowest, you need to have some variable recording the highest or lowest level outside of array. You cannot record this inside the array. Otherwise, you are doing an infinite loop inside the array itself. So for this reason, for any array operation, there are two parts. It's just like when we do the running total. There should be a running total variable defined outside of a loop. Similarly, you will define something like either it's flag or it's a recording variable like highest or lowest or running total, for example, array running total. Outside of the array first, define that, initialize that, maybe initializing as the first element of the array, then go through the array elements from 1 to the end. Remember, array starts at 0, but here we already initialized ourselves as, we initialize the recording variable as the first element. So we actually start from the second element, which is I equals to 1. And then you do all the comparison, all the running total that you want. If you want to get the highest, then you just do a comparison. When you get a higher number inside the array, you will change the highest to number. And similarly, you do the summing and average. Average is basically a sum, similar to here, and divided by the length, the total number, right? And then remember here, total equals to 0. You put total as equals 0 here. You can also put total as the units 0 and the starting from 1 here. Either way is fine. So these are some common array operations. And remember, always start from the defining of some flag or a recording variable, then run through the whole array one at a time. You get the first element as a highest, compare it to each following element. If the following element is higher, then you change the recording variable as the highest. So you get the new highest. Similarly, doing this for the lowest and doing this for the sum. So in Fibonacci calculation, we actually define an array based on Fibonacci's number of Fibonacci numbers that you want to calculate. Sometimes, if the amount of data must hold as unknown, we do not know how many elements we will have. A common practice is to size the array to the largest expected number of elements. Then use a counting variable to keep track on how much valid data is in the array. For example, if we know there are, like in our class, we know our school will not go beyond 50 students, then we can set this array size as 100. This is one example, right? Then you will start to, you will start to have a number and set up a count. This count is the number of elements that we actually have instead of the total length of the array. This is one way to create a partially filled arrays. An array is useful in combination with file. Why? Because if you consider what file is, text file is basically a list of string rows. And that's easier to convert into an array. It's just like an array is a list of strings. So text file and array are commonly related in many operations. So you want to save the content of an array to a file, then you can just do for loop and output print. If you want to read the file into an array, you will do the similar operation. You will start doing a for loop and read the file into an array. In that case, number will equals to next line of that file, like here, right? But the one thing different is for output, you pretty much know the size of the array, so you can use a for loop. But for input, you do not know how much row the file has. That's why you need to use a while. That's again another example of choosing different looping control structure. You need to know why we choose for write and the while for reading. Of course, if you read the file into an array, doing some operation and write it back, then you will use a while based on the controlling structure, depending how you want to work on it. So, and finally, array is the object. So we will do array return for a method the same way as any other object. We just directly write the array, and which returns the reference to this array object. You are creating this array, you are returning the reference to this array. But one thing different is when you define array, you are not defining this as object, but you define the return type, the array type with the square bracket. And one thing to note, when you return the array, you are not returning the size. When you're defining the return type of the method, you are not defining the size. You are only defining this is an array, but you don't specify what's the size. You are not writing like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You are not writing double 5. You are only writing double. And it's the caller's responsibility to get the size of array if it wants to operate on the array. Okay, so it's returning an array of doubles, but without specifying what's the size in the array definition, in the method definition. Instead, the array size should be obtained dynamically using the array.length field.